Podcast. Everybody's doing it. And I'm sure you're wondering, why haven't you done a podcast for your brand? Well, there are a couple of questions you need to answer before you jump in. So let's start by asking ourselves what exactly a podcast is. A podcast technically is an audio or video piece or series that is centered around a topic or theme. But if you ask cynical me, I'll say a podcast today is one or more people gathered around microphones talking about random shit. Oh, and don't forget the background with neon lights. Yeah, that's what I think they are these days, and I'm sticking to it. So you're wondering whether it works for brands. The simple answer is yes and no. It obviously doesn't work for brands when you just want to jump on the bandwagon because everybody is doing it and it's the in thing. However, podcasts can work for your brand if you craft something unique that aligns with your brand and creates valuable content for its listeners or watchers. Now you've decided to create a podcast for your brand. However, there are a couple of questions you need answered. The first question is, what are your goals? Is it awareness, where you just want as many people as possible to watch or listen to the content and have your brand out there? Or is your goal building a community? This could come in several forms. It could be an email newsletter where more and more people that listen subscribe and you add them to your list. Or it could be your social media followers. That's a community on its own. Or it could be engagement. You want to build or increase engagement for your brand, where you have more people talking about your brand and what you're doing. Another goal you may have is lead generation, where you just want to gather the data and create new leads or gather new leads, which may eventually be converted into customers. So once you've figured out what your goals are for the podcast, you then need to go into, okay, what topic or theme do you want to be discussing about? What do you want to center your podcast about? This is where you have to do a lot of deep thinking, because number one, it needs to be a topic that aligns with your brand essence. Number two, it needs to be something that there's enough content to be discussed, but there's enough content that can be created, meaning several discussions could be had around that topic. The next question will be, what type of podcast are you doing? One, is it audio or video? Then, is it one host, or do you want to host with different guests on different episodes? If you're doing a podcast with a solo host, essentially you're going to have one person talk deeply or take deep dives into a particular topic or theme. If you have a host with guests, definitely you're going to have a host who's pretty much going to be the moderator in discussions, and you have several guests. It could be one guest or more guests. The host then obviously has a couple of roles to play. For instance, moderate the guests or ensure the different talking points are covered in the episode, and obviously keep track of time. The next question you need to ask yourself is, what skill do you want your podcast to have? What I mean by this is, how large do you want it to have? And this is critical because you need to ensure you have enough resources to sustain at least a season of recording or filming of your podcast in the case of videos. So a good example is you can have a podcast where you literally just find one spare room in your office and make a podcast out of that room. Or you can work in an external studio where you build elaborate sets for the podcast. So that question is depending on you and how much resources you have at your disposal. What I'm going to talk about next is not necessarily a question, but we need to talk deeply about why podcasts have become so popular. And the reasons why they're popular are also going to help you decide how you want to craft your podcast, because they also give a bit of more information as to how a potential audience consumes podcasts content. One major reason why podcasts are popular is the ease of access. You can grab your device, connect to the link, or launch the app, and you're good to go. So that alone makes it easy to consume, and you have people that can consume a whole lot of content in that regard. Based on this feature as to why podcasts are popular, you can have different podcasts, for instance, daily rundowns. It could be news headlines. It could be tech rundowns or what's going on in the tech community. It could be anything, but daily rundowns are a very popular category. Another reason why podcasts are popular is because you have very niche topics. You'll be shocked at the number of strange or very unpopular topics that are available in terms of podcasts. For instance, you have topics like paranormal experiences, people that have experienced ghosts. You have things like, okay, mistakes in surgery. The reason why this is important, because as weird as topics may become, you have more niche and loyal followers listening to them and waiting for the next episode. So it could be a hit or miss sometimes, to be honest, but once you hit it, your audience is super loyal. They will not leave it for anything. And that is, as a business or as a brand, those are your super important leads or customers. That community is critical because you can always sell to them. Another reason why podcasts are popular is because they are the best content for multitasking. You could be cooking in the kitchen, you turn on a podcast, you listen to the podcast. You could be driving, you turn on the podcast, listen to the podcast. You could be working or studying, turn on the podcast, listen to the podcast. So this alone could guide you to what kind of topics will fit the audiences that are engaging in a particular activity. So for instance, you could have a podcast that is targeted at people during their daily commute to work or after work. So obviously that will guide your release times. Or you could have a podcast that is targeted at people in the kitchen when they are cooking. It could be released every weekend when they're doing major cooking for the family. So craft your message to fit people doing these activities. I always say, take those deep dives, think about what people are doing, think about the consumer behavior or your customer behavior, and target them, create content that targets them. The more your listeners or your audience feels part of your content or feels like the content is talking to them directly, the more loyal they become. Another reason why podcasts are popular is because there are already instant communities that podcasts can target. Instances will be the fitness community. The podcasts are centered around the fitness community. Nutrition, that people are becoming more intentional about what they eat. Maternity, which is a very big one. Pregnant women always look for new information, study, research. So that is an existing community on its own that you can target. So these communities are already in existence. So you can create podcasts that target those communities, making building your own list or building your audience easier. So I'm sure the features that make podcasts very popular have helped you to also streamline what kind of podcast you want to create for your brand. Now we're going to talk about, obviously, your brand is spending money. You need to ensure your brand has proper representation in this content, especially if it's video content. There are two major categories in brand representation. For audio-only podcasts, you could have things like the intro, where you have statements like powered by XXX, where XXX represents your brand. And you can have also short jingles in between of your brand, but make them really short. Don't keep them long, so it's not like a hard sell. We all know that people really don't like when their content is interrupted by ads, so make them very short. So if you're doing a podcast, I will suggest make those short ads maybe 10-15 seconds max. If you're doing a video podcast, the easy way for brand integration will be one, product placement, where you have branded items. For instance, if you're a beverage brand, you have branded mugs put on the podcast set. You could have a branded set if your podcast is on that scale. You can have branded set elements behind your guests and participants. You could also have logo flashes where your brand logo pops up or could be fixed from beginning to end of your podcast. Another thing is you can have squeeze backs, which is more of a broadcast thing, but nothing stops you from putting squeeze backs in your podcast content. Finally, you could have short adverts. Again, keep them really short. You could have 10 to 15 seconds, either animation or live action videos. Just come in between the content. Don't distract your audience too long from the content they've been enjoying. You also need to figure out the right points to insert your ads so it's not jarring to the audience. Ultimately, you must create content that is of value to the listener or the audience. In today's world where there's so much competition for eyeballs and attention, if your content is not of value, you are going to miss out, because since the remote was invented, the audience had the power to switch channels. Today, they have several remotes to switch channels. They can click and get off your channel, get off your platform. It's so easy for them to get off. So you need to keep them engaged, and the surefire way to keep an audience engaged is creating content that is of value to them. Now I'm pretty sure you've made the decision as to what kind of podcast you want to create, the scale, whether it's audio only, whether it's video, whether you want to shoot it in your office or you want to go to build an elaborate set. You have all of that sorted. Now it's time to get started, right? So if you're going to do it as a brand, I would say, you probably want to be in control of the most important elements of your podcast. So there are a couple of things you may want to get if you want to keep it in-house. Number one is the equipment, obviously. And the most critical equipment for a podcast, whether audio only or video, is your microphones. And there are all sorts of microphones available today which capture sound, in different ways, and their mounting options are quite different. But the easiest kind of mics today to get started in doing podcasts is similar mics that I'm wearing. These clip-on mics, they're available for cheap. You can get a mic system, two transmitters, one receiver. You can get them for as low as $200. High quality mics, that's what I used to record this podcast, and they've been performing absolutely brilliantly. Other mics you could use are shotgun mics, where you mount them externally. You don't need to clip them on clothing. However, you need to ensure that they're pointing at your host and guests line of audio. Another popular kind of microphone that is used for podcasts is broadcast microphones. Essentially those podcasts that you see on those boom arms. I particularly don't like those ones because, number one, they were designed for controlled environments. They were designed for the radio station where the room is acoustically treated and there's not a lot of external noise. However, you also notice when you watch podcasts that use them is once the host or guest moves away from the microphone, the sound levels quickly diminish. So that's my issue with those microphones. Apart from the fact that they look unwieldy in video podcasts, I really, really do not like them at all because they're just a distraction. For me, I believe especially your guests need to be as comfortable as they can. So when you have all those unwieldy things right in their face, I think it's a distraction and it makes them less comfortable. For guests, especially first-timers that have not been on podcasts before, I would strongly suggest you get microphones, clip-on microphones like this. Clip on their clothing. The designs of this kind of microphones is that they barely rub, so you don't have that issue of rubbing microphones. Once you clip it on their clothing, they forget it's there and they can feel free and have a conversation. The next piece of gear that you should be concerned about is a mixer and a recorder. I'm joining them together because today you have a lot of hybrid devices that do both mixing and recording. You have devices that have multiple channels from 4 to as many as 32, and they record internally every single track as separate audio files. Brilliant machines. You also have devices that were designed specifically for podcast recording. Rode has a Rode Podcaster. It's a podcast device where you have multiple inputs, you have mixing, you have live streaming from it. There are many devices that are available today that are not expensive and they're easy to work with. Obviously, if you're doing like a podcast with a solo guest, you may or may not need mixers. You can connect your microphone directly to your recording device, which could be a computer, and you're off to the races. However, if you have a host and guest or guests, you definitely are going to need a mixer. Don't rely on internal recording of the camera, because the truth is cameras today have worse and worse audio circuitry in them. That is what sets broadcast cameras apart, because they have proper audio professional inputs, they have XLR inputs, they have proper preamps and things like that. But cameras today, like the DSLRs and small cinematic cameras, do not have all of these things. They just make provision for reference audio and that's it. And reference audio, trust me, is not good enough, especially for content that needs the cleanest audio possible. Another thing you're obviously going to need if you're doing video podcasts is the camera. So I'm not going to talk about or try to convince you to get a particular kind of camera. That decision is left to you based on your budget and your workflow. If you're the kind of brand that wants the highest quality of videos uploaded to your channel, if you want 4K videos uploaded to your channel, you obviously have to get a 4K camera that has good signal processing and get good lenses and all. However, if you're doing multiple camera shoots, in the case of a host and several guests, you may or may not have a live switcher where you can switch online between the different camera sources, or you just have your editor edits or the recordings or the ISOs of the individual cameras. But one thing is important: ensure your cameras match. So obviously, if you're purchasing cameras for the podcast purpose, just buy the same camera. Buy the same camera, buy the same brand of lens, because lenses have different characteristics, and you don't want your pictures to look jarring when you cut in between one camera to the other. So the next thing in order to get started is the space, and I'm particularly targeting this at those that are kind of creating a podcast studio from their existing office or existing space. I'm not talking about those that are hiring professional studios. Obviously, if you hire professional studios, they're hiring a production company to go and they will handle the entire production professionally for you. But if you're creating a podcast space within your existing office, there are a couple of things you have to think of. Number one is the acoustics of the room. What I mean by acoustics is what the sound does within a room, how the sound travels. And this is critical in ensuring that you don't have reverb or echo in your recordings. If you have a room that has straight walls only and is fairly large, you're going to have those echo problems. A quick and easy way to get started with your acoustic treatment is ensure that room is rugged, meaning you have a soft rug on the floor of the room. That will help to dampen sound that is bouncing all over the place. Another way to help with the acoustics is if you have curtains or drapes in the room, they help dampen the sound that is going to bounce off the walls. So the curtains just absorb the sound, so you have cleaner audio. So apart from the acoustics, when that is covered, the next thing you need to figure out is the soundproofing of the room. Especially if your office is situated in a noisy area and there's external sound or noises coming through into the room, you got to figure out how to eliminate those sounds. So in terms of soundproofing, I would say, first of all, if you have that option, choose a room that has the least number of windows, that has more concrete. If you have an office that has concrete walls or block walls, that will help. If you can't get a room with fewer windows and you have noise coming especially through the windows, an easy way is to get foam blocks. You can approach mattress manufacturers these days and give them dimensions. They'll cut foam blocks for you. It's quite easy. You can just stick them and use them to block the windows. So yeah, those are easy ways to soundproof, in quotes, your existing podcast room. The final thing you need to think about in terms of preparing your room is the lighting of your room in terms of video podcasts. The easiest way is to get a set of studio LED lights. I covered them in a previous video where you could get a set of 3 lights from manufacturers like Newer or GVM. You have 3 LED studio panels or LED panels. That's an easy way to get that place lit. Another way is you can use practical lights. An easy way to go about this is if you have an office that has a lot of overhead lighting, you could add a bit more to it. Like if you have soft LED lighting from above, from the ceiling above, you could speak to your electrical guys, have more of those light panels installed in the ceiling, so you have more lights coming from above. It gives a studio effect, even though you still need additional lights for field lights or whatever. But that helps a lot, so you don't have to always deal with setting up lights for every time you want to record. The next thing you got to figure out is editing, whether you have audio only podcast or video podcast. Editing, I don't need to go into depth about how to get your videos or your audio edited. You have several options. DaVinci Resolve is available for free, where it even gives you the opportunity to do auto transcription. Essentially, it uses AI to transcribe what you've said in your podcast, and you can actually use a transcription to get your videos edited. It's a brilliant feature. I know Adobe Premiere has it as well, but since Premiere is a paid software, DaVinci Resolve offers all of this for free. So look it up, speak to your editors, they can speed up your workflow. Finally, after sorting out equipment, the room, the lighting, and all of that, this is the most critical part of getting your podcast out there, which is distribution. How do you publish your podcast? A couple of years back, there was a popular platform called Anchor FM, which was eventually acquired by Spotify. And what they did was brilliant. They allowed you to record using their web-based software. They allowed you to do basic edits, and they also allowed you to publish to all platforms, including Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other platforms you have. So it's essentially a one stone kill several birds approach. And you can still do it today using the Spotify platform, where you can upload your podcast, upload your recorded audio, and you have it published to several platforms, and also help with monetizing your podcast for those of you that are seeking to earn revenue from your podcast content. Another thing these platforms do is they help with the analytics. They help you track who's listening to your podcast, at what times they're listening to, where they're coming from in terms of geographical location. All of this data is very important in determining where your potential audience and your community is going to be built, or how your community is going to be built. So it's critical, whatever platform you're going with. Gives you publishing, gives you analytics, and gives you monetization. Spotify is a brilliant example. Other options are Buzzsprout and Red Circle. These are also similar to Spotify that can help you publish your podcast. By the way, all of these examples I've given apply to audio-only podcasts. For video podcasts, I'm not going to lie, there's no better platform than YouTube. That is where podcasts are worth the most. That's where people search for podcasts. So just stick to YouTube for now. It's my personal opinion, and it's the advice I can give to you. Don't try to use any other platform for video podcasts. Stick to YouTube. However, for your marketing purposes, you can then create bite-sized content, which are like episodic trailers, short videos that you can share on social media, like TikTok, like Instagram, like Facebook, and you can then use that to attract customers to then come to your YouTube channel. So remember, always use those to market your podcast content, but direct that traffic back to YouTube to watch the complete episodes. I think I've covered the major things you can do, or the questions you need to ask yourself in terms of getting your podcast ready for your brand. Now it's time to go and create. So I'd like to hear from all of you. What have been your experiences in creating podcasts? Have you done it before? Are you struggling to create the first podcast for your brand? Share your experiences in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and click on the notification icon. My name is Soji Ogunnaike, and I'm a video producer, director, editor, consultant, and you can catch me on all social media platforms at Soji Oguns.